Listen carefully. You think he's losing interest. You believe the signs are obvious. The distance, the silence, the inconsistency. You tell yourself that if a man truly cared, he would make it simple. He would be direct. He would chase. But what if everything you've been reading is completely backward? What if the silence is not indifference at all? What if the coldness is actually hiding something far more intense? And here is the strange part. The more emotionally affected he becomes, the more controlled and detached he may start to appear. Stay with me, because what I'm about to explain changes the way you interpret male behavior entirely. Most women miss these signals completely. They walk away at the exact moment his thoughts about them begin to grow deeper. They assume the lack of obvious pursuit means the connection has faded, while in reality his mind has become more consumed than ever. There is one specific pattern that exposes everything, and once you understand it, you will start replaying conversations, eye contact, random messages, strange disappearances, all the moments that once confused you. Suddenly, the patterns will become impossible to ignore. I'm going to reveal the hidden behaviors that show he thinks about you constantly, even if he acts emotionally distant, even if he pretends not to care, even if every surface-level sign seems to suggest otherwise. Because there is a psychological reaction that often happens when a man feels strongly attracted to someone but is afraid of what that attraction is doing to him. And once you recognize this, you will stop misunderstanding his behavior forever. But first, we need to talk about the painful mistake most women make, the confusion, the emotional contradiction, the reason everything feels upside down. Imagine this. He takes forever to answer your messages. When you see him in person, he acts calm, almost too calm. He doesn't initiate as much anymore. And when you spend time together, he behaves as if you are just another ordinary part of his routine. Naturally, your mind starts spiraling. Maybe I imagined the connection. Maybe he never cared. Maybe I should stop hoping and move on completely. But what if the opposite is happening beneath the surface? When a man becomes deeply emotionally affected by a woman, his mind can shift into something psychologists often describe as defensive avoidance. It sounds complicated, maybe even made up, but the dynamic itself is very real. Here's what you need to understand. Men do not always express attraction in the way women expect them to. When emotions become too intense, a man does not always move closer. Sometimes he retreats. Sometimes he pulls away. Sometimes he creates distance. Why? Because strong attraction creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of losing emotional control. Fear of becoming exposed. And when many men experience those emotions, their instinct is not connection. Their instinct is self-protection. So his behavior becomes contradictory. His mind tells him to step back so he can feel balanced again. And this is why so many women misread coldness as disinterest. Because the more he thinks about you, the more emotionally affected he becomes. And the more emotionally affected he becomes, the more he may try to hide it. Thinking about you unsettles him. It distracts him. It forces him to feel emotions he cannot fully control. So outwardly he becomes restrained, while internally he remains mentally attached. And this is where things become fascinating. There are certain signs that reveal when this is happening, and one of them is so powerful that once you notice it, you will never look at him the same way again. First, pay attention to how he watches you when he believes you are unaware. This is huge, yet most women overlook it because they focus only on direct communication. But attraction often reveals itself indirectly. A man who constantly thinks about you studies you quietly. Not intentionally at first, it happens automatically. He notices your expressions, your habits, your tone, the way you react to people around you. He notices how you laugh when you're genuinely relaxed. He notices what changes your mood. He notices when another person gets your attention. You may catch him staring at you briefly across a room before he suddenly looks away. That moment matters more than you realize. That quick withdrawal is not boredom. It is awareness mixed with restraint. It is him realizing he has been too focused on you and trying to regain control before anyone notices. Because a man who feels nothing does not repeatedly observe. He does not scan for patterns. He does not pay quiet attention. In the digital world, this behavior appears differently. He watches your stories almost immediately but rarely reacts. He notices every new picture, every subtle shift, every update, but remains silent. And silence here does not mean absence. Silence often means containment, because engaging too openly risks exposing how much attention he is already giving you internally. Attention is emotional investment, and emotional investment is the beginning of attachment. If he consistently watches without fully stepping forward, it often means you already occupy space in his mind far more than he admits. The second sign is even more revealing. He remembers details you barely considered important. This is where casual interest separates from emotional fixation. You mention something small in conversation. Maybe you talked briefly about a stressful week, a favorite food, a childhood memory, a fear, or something random you assumed nobody would retain. Weeks later, he brings it up naturally, without making a big deal about it. And you wonder if maybe he's simply observant. Maybe he's polite. Maybe he just has a good memory. No, most people forget details that carry no emotional weight for them. Men especially tend to remember what feels emotionally relevant. If he remembers the small things you barely emphasized, it means your conversations replayed in his mind after they ended. His attention returned to moments connected to you. He reflected on them without even realizing it. That is not surface-level attraction. That is mental presence. And the most interesting part is this. Many men are not even consciously aware they are doing it. Attraction often operates beneath conscious logic first. His brain begins prioritizing information connected to you before he fully understands why you matter so much to him. The third sign appears through other people before it appears through him. Watch the environment around him carefully. His friends behave differently when you're near. They glance at him. They glance at you. Sometimes they smile in ways that feel strangely knowing. Sometimes they casually mention your name as if you are already part of conversations happening behind closed doors. Men rarely speak openly about emotional attraction in direct language. Instead, they hint. They test reactions. They bring someone up indirectly. If his friends recognize you quickly or treat you like someone familiar despite limited interaction, it usually means your name has been mentioned repeatedly when you were not there. That matters, because men do not repeatedly discuss women who have no emotional impact on them. At that point, you are no longer invisible in his world. You have become mentally important enough to exist inside conversations with the people closest to him. And now we arrive at the sign that confuses women more than any other. He suddenly reappears, creates connection, then disappears again. This behavior drives women insane because it feels inconsistent and emotionally mixed. But ironically, it is often one of the strongest indicators that you occupy his thoughts far more than he wants to admit. Out of nowhere, he sends something random. A message, a question, a memory, a small comment that reminds him of you. There is no dramatic confession attached to it, no huge emotional explanation, just enough contact to break the silence between you. Then the conversation flows naturally again. The chemistry feels alive, familiar, comfortable. And for a moment, you think maybe things are finally moving forward. Then suddenly he pulls away again. The silence returns, and your mind immediately asks the painful question, what did I do wrong? But here is what many women never realize. He often disappears not because the interaction meant nothing, but because it meant too much. Reaching out gave him emotional relief. Pulling back gave him a sense of control again. Because every emotionally charged interaction increases the vulnerability he is trying to manage internally. So he moves toward you emotionally, then retreats to regain balance. And that cycle continues until either he finally accepts his feelings or fear keeps controlling the connection. This is approach and avoidance unfolding in real time. His desire keeps pulling him closer to you, while his fear quietly drags him back again. So he moves back and forth between the two. And this is the part that clearly proves you are occupying space inside his mind. The moments when he suddenly reaches out are never random. They happen when the emotional tension inside him becomes too strong to suppress. When thoughts of you become impossible to silence. When distance no longer gives him peace. If you meant nothing to him, there would be no internal conflict, no emotional pull, no repeated cycle. A man who feels indifferent does not create patterns. He simply disconnects and moves on without resistance. And once you recognize this pattern, you begin seeing it everywhere, because what appears inconsistent on the surface is often emotional regulation happening underneath. What looks confusing externally is usually someone internally trying to regain control over feelings they did not expect to experience. Then another sign starts revealing itself beneath all of this. He behaves differently around you than he does around everyone else. This sign is quiet, almost invisible at first, but once you notice it, you cannot unsee it anymore. Pay attention to how he acts around other women, friends, co-workers, or people whose opinions do not emotionally affect him. Around them, he is natural, relaxed, predictable. His energy moves freely without effort. There is no hesitation inside him, no internal monitoring, no emotional pressure sitting beneath the interaction. But the moment he is around you, something changes. Maybe he suddenly becomes calmer than usual. Maybe he grows more careful with his words. Perhaps he jokes more than normal to release nervous energy, or maybe he becomes quieter and more restrained. Sometimes his voice shifts. Sometimes he avoids eye contact for too long, and other times he holds it a second longer than he normally would before breaking away. These reactions are not accidental. They are nervous system responses. When a man feels emotionally neutral, his body remains neutral too. There is no disruption inside him. But when someone affects him emotionally, his system becomes alert, more aware, slightly tense, more controlled. And this is where many women completely misunderstand male behavior. Reserved behavior is not always a lack of attraction. In many cases, it is evidence of attraction. Men do not guard themselves around women they feel nothing for. They do not carefully regulate their words, reactions, body language, or emotional presence for someone who feels irrelevant. They become more cautious only when something matters deeply to them. So if he appears more deliberate around you, more composed, more thoughtful, more self-aware, It often means he is actively monitoring himself because he does not want to ruin the connection. People only monitor themselves when they feel there is something meaningful at stake. Then comes another sign that most women miss completely. He begins testing you, but not in ways that are obvious or dramatic. This is one of the most common ways men show emotional interest without openly admitting how much they care. He may casually bring up another woman, not necessarily to provoke jealousy directly, but to quietly observe your reaction. He might suddenly pull back emotionally just to see whether you immediately begin chasing him. Maybe he delays plans unexpectedly, shifts his energy, or introduces uncertainty into the dynamic, simply to observe how you emotionally respond to instability. And most women never realize these moments are tests. They assume he is insecure. They assume he is inconsistent or emotionally unavailable. But often, he is observing far more than he is speaking. Inside himself, he is asking silent questions. Does she stay emotionally grounded? Does she lose control when things feel uncertain? Does she pressure me emotionally? Does she respect herself even when she feels anxious? Can she remain centered without forcing reassurance from me? Men who feel something genuine become more cautious because they are not simply searching for excitement. They are evaluating emotional safety. They do not want emotional chaos. They do not want constant volatility. They want to know whether closeness with you will feel peaceful or emotionally exhausting over time. So instead of asking directly, they observe the emotional atmosphere. They quietly study your reactions. And this is the important part. If he truly did not care, he would not test anything at all. He would either pursue casually without emotional investment or disappear completely. Testing only appears when emotional investment and uncertainty exist together at the same time. This is where many women unknowingly damage the connection. They overreact emotionally. They immediately seek reassurance. They explain themselves too much. They try to force clarity before the other person is emotionally ready to provide it. They begin managing the connection out of fear of losing it. But emotional pressure rarely creates closeness for men. Most of the time, it creates retreat. The woman who naturally passes these tests is not cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. She is simply centered within herself. She does not collapse emotionally under uncertainty. She does not chase immediate answers to calm temporary anxiety. She allows him to sit with his own emotions instead of trying to control them for him. And this leads to the final sign, the one that quietly reveals exactly where you stand in his emotional world. He remains emotionally present without fully claiming you. This is perhaps the hardest behavior to understand, but it is often the most revealing of all. He does not disappear entirely. He never completely shuts the door. He does not fully move on emotionally, even if distance exists between you. Even during periods of silence, he keeps a small thread of connection alive. A reaction here, a check-in there, a subtle acknowledgement of your existence. Something small that quietly keeps you within his emotional orbit without requiring full commitment. And many women misunderstand this behavior completely. They interpret it as indecision or lack of seriousness. But psychologically, it is often emotional containment. He keeps the connection alive because allowing it to completely die would feel like losing something emotionally significant. At the same time, fully stepping into the relationship would require emotional vulnerability that he may not yet feel prepared for. So he remains near the edge of it all. Not necessarily because he is manipulative or playing games, but because internally he is negotiating with himself. And this is where your behavior becomes extremely important. You cannot force someone into emotional certainty. You cannot convince a person into readiness through analysis, pressure, or emotional management. The moment you begin trying to control the outcome, the energy shifts away from attraction and toward emotional supervision. And men rarely fall deeply in love in environments where they feel emotionally managed. What actually draws him closer is your stability, your ability to remain warm without chasing, open without forcing, present without demanding, emotionally grounded without becoming controlling. Men naturally move toward what feels emotionally calm and safe inside them. And strangely enough, the woman who does not desperately need immediate answers often becomes the woman he cannot stop thinking about. Because unresolved emotional tension does not disappear quickly. It deepens over time. Here is the truth that very few people openly talk about. The man who withdraws when he feels something real is not always weak. Very often, he is deeply aware. Aware that emotions carry consequences. Aware that emotional attachment changes people internally. Aware that once certain feelings become real, they cannot easily be undone. And if you are capable of sitting inside uncertainty without losing yourself emotionally, without pulling him aggressively toward you or pushing him away defensively, you slowly become a psychological reference point inside his mind. Someone his thoughts continuously return to. Not because you chased him, not because you convinced him, but because you remained emotionally intact even during silence. And that leaves an impression far deeper than most people realize. If this resonates with you, if you suddenly understand his behavior more clearly than before, take a slow breath for a moment. You do not need to react immediately. You do not need to force decisions right now. Real clarity often arrives only after emotional pressure disappears. And what happens next is the part most women never get to witness because they interrupt the process too early. A man does not move from attraction into action the instant he feels something emotionally powerful. He moves when his internal resistance finally weakens enough for desire to become decision. And this process happens silently. While you are wondering where you stand, his mind is often negotiating with itself behind the scenes. He weighs emotional risks internally. He measures what this connection could cost him emotionally. He asks himself questions he would probably never say aloud. What if I lose emotional control here? What if I become more attached than I intended? What if this changes parts of me I have spent years protecting? Men do not fear connection in the same way many people assume. What they often fear is transformation, because real attraction threatens identity. Genuine emotional connection forces a man to confront parts of himself he has kept tightly controlled for years. It exposes vulnerability. It disrupts emotional routines. It challenges the version of himself he feels safest being. That is why men frequently slow down when feelings become serious, not because emotions disappear, but because the emotions become heavier. And this is exactly where many women unintentionally become the reason the relationship stops progressing. They mistake his pause for lack of interest. They assume silence means emotional absence. They panic before the emotional process has had time to unfold naturally. So they begin pushing for certainty too early. They seek constant reassurance. They demand emotional definitions before the other person has emotionally organized himself internally. And instead of allowing desire to mature naturally, they overload the connection with pressure, urgency, and fear. But attraction rarely grows well under emotional force. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remain emotionally balanced long enough for the other person to hear their own feelings clearly. Because when a man finally stops fighting what he feels, his actions become much more direct, much more intentional, and much harder to misunderstand.